Our next session is all about supporting adaptation action, and our first speakers in this session are Nancy Saich and James Falzon. Nancy is a chartered civil engineer who specialised earlier in her career in transport, ports and coastal work. And after 13 years of work as an engineer, she joined the European Investment Bank, the Projects Directorate, in 1998. And amongst her other responsibilities, she has a specific role as the European Investment Bank's Chief Advisor on Climate and Environment, and is responsible for leading the work on the carbon footprint of the bank's project portfolio, mainstreaming climate resilience into the bank's project work, and on all climate finance tracking, accounting and auditing. Sounds like a very responsible job to me. Her colleague in this presentation is James Falzon, so there'll be a double act here. James is a Policy and Climate Finance Associate and leads the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development policy dialogue activities, supporting investment operations in such sectors as infrastructure, water, energy and manufacturing. So, a very interesting presentation in prospect. Nancy, welcome to the forum.
So, thank you very much for inviting EIB and EBRD to come and do this, this particular presentation. I think it's important to highlight that the two banks are not only multilateral development banks, but also European finance institutions. And because of that, we work in a number of networks together. We work with the multilateral development banks on many climate finance issues and on mainstreaming climate risk management. But we also work very closely with our other EU finance institutions, particularly in adaptation, as I will show you, in a group with the wonderful name EBOD, or if you're the Nordic Investment Bank, I think you say EBOD. But anyway, it's a very, very important group that was formed in 2009, aiming to really share knowledge, tools, and good practice so as to accelerate the work on adaptation. And I will show you today some of the work we've been doing as a group, and then give you a bit of information also about the European Investment Bank. So a quick slide about the EIB, because we hide in Luxembourg, many people don't know we're there, but we are in fact the biggest multilateral development bank. We are owned by the EU, by the 28 member states of the EU, and 90% of our lending annually is in the EU, but nevertheless 10%, which still amounts to €7 billion a year, is outside globally across all areas of the world in developing countries. And we do this mainly by lending, obviously, because we are a bank, but we also blend with EU funds and other concessional funding, and we also have a large advisory role, both from our own sector experts, which is where I'm based in the Projects Directorate, but also we have an advisory department and the European Advisory Hub. So on to EBOD. What is really important is to say that we feel that it's really a work of bringing together a lot of different institutions who are working on the same challenge. We have slightly different mandates, we have slightly different types of operations, but we're all aiming to accelerate the work on climate resilience in our projects and supporting our clients. And to that aim, we felt that we needed to produce something to help drive this forward, and a note was produced last year about our gathered experience, and you can see there the members of EBOD, and I've got some copies of the note here. James and I have got a few, depending on how nice you are to us, we can hand them out. They are also available in French, and I think EBRD even have a few copies in Russian, so if you're interested for that, you can get a copy in Russian. Why did we do this? Well, the important thing is that adaptation is increasingly being discussed. It is no longer the little brother, little sister of mitigation, although I certainly wouldn't want us to take our eyes off the ball of reduction of CO2. But nevertheless, gathering more and accelerating the efforts on climate resilience it's gathering interest because of, for example, the GCF funding is supposed to be targeted 50% towards adaptation. The Paris Agreement commits us to doing a lot more, all financial flows ultimately being low carbon and climate resilient. And we, as many others have adopted strategies and policies which clearly put adaptation centre stage. So, what was part of the problem? Well, one of the problems we found was that neither internally nor externally is there yet sufficient knowledge in any of the industries we work in or in the consultancy industry to really address this as fast as it needs to be addressed. There was often a feeling that either people were thinking they needed to do far too much analysis, reanalyze perhaps all global climate models, or perhaps just doing something very lightweight. And we felt that we needed to bring together the players in this, the people who support the clients, the people who support the ports in this case, and the transport industry. And so we organised a day with about 100 consultants, with the German Climate Service Centre and the EU finance institutions, to have an exchange on how we could work better together and how we could bring together the knowledge that we'd all gathered from working on projects anecdotally and put it together as a more generic piece of guidance. What we wanted was to come up with a knowledge product that would assist lots of people to avoid reinventing the wheel. So although it's not targeted at ports, I think you will find when you look at it that it's very relevant to ports and other transport infrastructure and operations. So these are the UFIWAC members who contributed to the note. We had also JASPERS, which is EU-funded assistance in newer member states, looking at major projects. They were obviously, along with the Climate Service Centre, supporting this. And we had, as I said, nearly 100 consultants who attended the original workshop, but we also had a number of consultancies who contributed to the note on its various iterations. And we felt that that really brought a much bigger breadth of knowledge, both the financing institutions, the data and climate analysis of the Climate Service Centre, and the consultancies. And what we were aiming to do was have something which would help people better integrate climate change information and adaptation into project development, whether it's pre-feasibility, feasibility, EIAs, as was mentioned earlier in the new directive. This needs to be incorporated into EIAs. We wanted to be, it to be a note that was useful for all these types of activities. So, it's interesting. Despite my best efforts, I've still managed to lose some. On my screen, I have to say those stray letters were all in the right place. So, never mind. It has several sections. And what I think is very interesting is that each of the people involved in this note had their own specific expertise and thing that they were really concerned about from their practice on real projects, talking to real clients. And when you put those experiences together, you get something which is much greater than the sum of the parts. So, I mean, if I was to put my hand in the air, I'd probably say that my big thing was probably scoping. I'm big on making sure that the studies and the analysis and the data you use is appropriate for the size and location of the project. But other people were very, very concerned about the analysis of costs. Some of the others were very concerned about communicating the findings so that clients can make informed decisions. So again, if you put it together, you get something which brings all that knowledge and experience. On the project scoping, I think one of the things I want to highlight is that we really emphasise the need to look outside the physical project boundary or even the operational project boundary, particularly with ports, as we heard. It's vital to look at the transport connections, how the staff get to and from the port during extreme weather, for example, the IT and power connections. Identifying, depending on what project you're looking at, what's the appropriate timescale, and really focusing on identifying the priority vulnerabilities to assess rather than a sort of one-size-fits-all. And I've just added a last point, which is something that we've been doing a lot on in some work we've been doing in the Caribbean, which is about making sure that you gather the historical knowledge of the technical people, of what has happened to the system or the port or the hinterland connections during past extreme events. Often these people are not actually asked, and there's a huge amount of wealth of knowledge of how the system and the port responded to the last flood or the last storm or the last hurricane or the last heat wave, and that knowledge should form a basis for the scoping. Then, obviously, there's so much climate information out there, you need to be able to determine what would be the appropriate level and where to gather the right sources. We have in the note quite a lot of information about ways and places to find the appropriate level of climate information. Making sure that whatever is decided to propose as adaptation options actually address the climate vulnerability. And I think we've heard a lot about flooding, and I certainly wouldn't want to say that flooding wasn't important, but one of the experiences we have is it's very easy to focus on flooding and forget to look at some of the other major risks which may be creating vulnerabilities in the port. It could be that there are things to do with extreme wind loading, for example, on equipment. It may be that extreme heat is an issue. Again, maybe one should start by taking a step back and making sure that the climate vulnerability has looked at all of the different possible impacts, and then identify how in this project design or in the operation of the port would it be best to deal with this vulnerability. So the climate risk management starting from an informed position. Now again, we're often asked, and we had a very good example this morning from Richenda about indeed analysing the costs and benefits, particularly of choices of options, but also timing of options. I think that's extremely important. Although I think what I would like to also stress is that despite the fact that we're an investment bank and we obviously like to finance projects, we're very clear that along with the physical investments, which may be made at some point in the future or may be needed immediately, there are other management climate risk management tools there. There may be insurance, there may be operational changes, maybe warning systems. It was also mentioned the IT options can improve the warning systems. So it's a whole range of things, some of which may be physical investments, but obviously the cost savings and the avoided damages do need to be quantified as much as is possible to do. I mentioned the importance of providing this information not only for the people and the organisations involved in the port, whether they're public or private, but also other entities, for example, the city or the transport network, the transport utility that's responsible for the connections to the port, or maybe the power utility. The decisions need to be made having really clear and well understood findings from the work that's been done. So the recommendations need to be transparent and allow people, support people to make appropriate decisions. Lastly, of course, the whole scenario discussion, uncertainty is all changing, and it's clear that monitoring of the decisions that have been made, or indeed whether to delay the decisions, and monitoring and evaluation is going to be critical to assess whether or not the decision that was made 2 or 3 years ago is still valid, or perhaps some investments should be accelerated, or perhaps indeed that now that there's a better understanding of the speed of the change, perhaps other options become available to the port to respond to that risk. So how is this guide being used? Well, obviously it's being used by all the entities themselves. We are using it internally to help support terms of reference for projects. It's being used by JASPERS, as I said, who are the EU-funded and EIB and EBRD technical assistance program, which is based in the EIB. We obviously co-finance not only with other IFIs, but also with commercial banks. And there's been a number of other financiers interested in using this guidance. And that's really why we were also invited here today, to share it with you and to hope that you find it also useful. So just to sum up, I thought about picking out 1 or 2 ports that we've funded, but of course, given that we are the EU's bank and the EU has just celebrated its 60th birthday, we have over the years been in most EU ports in some way or another. One of our drivers is to support the 10T network. We also have projects in inland waterways as well as seaports, and infrastructure remains a key sector for EIB. So rather than picking out one or other of the different ports, I would just say that is critical for us as part of our climate strategy, but also because we are a public bank and we want to support good projects and support our clients. It's critical for us to continue to work with ports and with the hinterland network clients to increase their resilience to climate change. And thank you very much for inviting us. I will now hand over to James from EBRD, who's going to give you the EBRD's perspective.
Thanks very much, Nancy. I'm also suffering from a bit of a cough and cold, so I apologize in advance. Okay, so thanks very much. My name is James Falzon. I'm an associate from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And in my presentation, I'm going to really focus on how the UFIWAC standards and other guidelines fit into our operations. So just by way of background, the EBRD is an international financing institution. We operate in around 36 countries, southern, eastern Mediterranean region, Central and Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. Many of our countries of operation are very vulnerable to the risks of climate change. The infrastructure that's there is aging, and the technologies are outdated, and the capacity, technical and financial, is really lacking to try and address some of the issues that are really going to be affecting these countries. So in terms of adaptation finance, the EBRD has, since 2011, invested around €1 billion in 160 projects. This has led to around €4 billion of projects becoming more climate resilient. In the port sector, the EBRD is really active in the port sector. The EBRD's mission is to really help countries transition to open market-based economies, and ports are really one of the mechanisms that helps international trade happen. So for us, ports are very important. At the moment, we have a portfolio of around 50 projects with a total value of €1 billion in about 17 countries. And our mandate, as well as an international financing institution, as a public development bank, is to ensure that we're transitioning to more sustainable ports. So that involves looking at opportunities for climate change mitigation measures to be introduced, energy efficiency, green technologies, but also trying to think about how we can integrate adaptation considerations into the investments that we do. Just looking at a couple of examples of the kinds of measures that have been introduced into some of our investments. For a port expansion in Poland that was undertaken a couple of years ago, in response to some of the climate risks that were identified, the adaptation measures that were adopted included designing the quayside structures so that they can cope with a sea level rise of 6 to 10 millimeters per year over the next 100 years, and also some non-structural measures such as ensuring that the right communication channels are in place between the port authority and the relevant institutions so that the right information is available at the right time. For a new port facility in Morocco, in response to some of the key climate risks that were identified, there were again some structural and non-structural measures that were introduced into the project. The breakwater design took into account the expected sea level rise. There's the risk of more frequent, I should say, heat extremes in Morocco, and the equipment that was put in place was designed to really withstand those temperature extremes. And also some non-structural measures, including adopting an emergency response plan and coastal erosion monitoring scheme. So from our experience, I guess I'd like to just talk towards the UFIWAC guidance. I mean, as a financing institution, we're constantly looking to try and understand how we can improve the efficiency and effectiveness of our operations, and ensure that what we're doing is best practice. And what we've seen, and it makes sense because it's an emerging space, is that at the moment it's being done on a case-by-case basis, and this can be time-consuming and costly. And also the best practices that are generated in particular projects are often being, there's a risk that they're not being transmitted back into the community. And so a question that we're constantly asking ourselves, and with our partners in the UFIWAC group, is how can we really transform our operations and processes so that these future investments that we do routinely take into account best practice adaptation. And Nancy spoke about the UFIWAC guidance, and for us this is really key for us as a financing institution. These guidelines really help act as a reference points. They improve consistency between the different approaches that we do. They really, a small thing is that they enhance understanding of terminology, and that way you can improve the communication between the different stakeholders. It lowers transaction costs for each project, and it allows for the benefits to be more easily communicated. At the EBRD, we, in 2013, as a first step in the port sector, we developed some internal technical guidance in order to build experience, and these were subsequently applied in a number of our port sector investments, such as the examples that I showed earlier. And the lessons that we learned from this really fed into the UFIWAC guidance. And so now that when we do a project, we attach the UFIWAC guidance to our TORs, and that's the basis for our consultants and for the people designing the projects, doing the feasibility studies, to integrate adaptation into the process. Looking forwards, this is my last slide. Looking forwards, we'd really like to. We really look forward to the work that's being done, for example, in the PIANC Working Group 178, to produce industry-led guidelines for integrating climate adaptation into ports. And we see our role as the EBRD to road test some of these guidelines and to try and get practical experiences on the ground on how these things work, where there could be some improvements, and hopefully feed this back into future iterations of guidelines and help the guidelines become more usable and more systematically applied in all the different investments that are happening on the ground. And we've recently been awarded some finance from the GEF to do some work in Morocco, and we'll be looking to create some partnerships also with the PIANC to see how we can road test some of the guidelines that come out of that working group. Thank you very much.